In this demonstration, we'll be tracking the life cycle of invoices across an organization's AP workflow. So in this scenario, we'd be touching multiple data sources and backend applications, including an invoice portal, OCR mechanism, some workflow, possibly document archiving, and of course, ERP. Now in this scenario, I'm going to point out to a file that has some events which would have been generated by one or more of those systems of record. Okay, these events relate to the different touch points that have occurred along these invoices processes. So we've introspected that file and we've got some field mapping set up for us here. This is our drag and drop field mapping interface. The key here is that we want to make sure we have 3 data points in order to get started with this timeline analysis. This is going to be true for any data source that we're pulling event data from. We need to make sure we have a timestamp that tells us when any given event has occurred, a process identifier, which we call a timeline ID. This is, in this scenario, going to be an invoice number or an invoice ID. It's that unique key that joins together all the different events that occur as a part of an invoice's lifecycle into that same context. Lastly, we're going to need an event or activity name. What happened to the invoice at that point in time? So you can think about this type of data as transactional or audit trail type of data. When did something happen? What did it occur to? And what occurred? Apart from that, you've got these fields in purple, which are going to be our attributes or dimensions, ways that we can slice and dice, filter, give more context to our analysis. So these will vary depending on the system we're pulling from, our use case, and really what we're interested in. In this case, we've got things like vendor, AP clerk, location, department, and source. Right, but they'll be different depending on the client and also the application we're pulling from. Now, this is an example where we're manually pointing out to a file and ingesting some data. We can automate this entire data load procedure in production scenario, so we can set it up to pull data from your source systems based on a time interval and refresh the data within the analysis. Not to mention, we would be pulling from those myriad different systems that I mentioned at the top. This is an example of a single data source. Now, when we pull from different application or data sources, the requirement there is that we have a matching or joining process identifier, timeline ID, across those different application sources. This way, the tool can take the events from all those distinct inputs and insert them into the correct timelines within the analysis automatically for you. Alright, so once we've got our data gathered and mapped here, we would then load it into the project for analysis. Now, as soon as that data load is done, which in this case with this data set takes less than 30 seconds to load, you're immediately going to get a whole heap of insights about this invoice process and the data set that we're working with. This is our overview page, and you'll notice as we go, we'll be using this right-hand bar to navigate. Each one of these different icons represents an analysis tool or module and answers a different type of question about this invoice process. Overview gives us good general high-level stats for what data set we're working with, things around duration, how long on average, and a range of time does it take for us to process these invoices, the number of events or activities that went into the processing. Now, I have input a few cost examples that are going to show us full population costs as well as an average per invoice cost of processing. We've also got a breakout of the 17 different possible events that could have occurred in this process. Here's a listing of all of those, so I get a view on exactly what's happening within my process, which is important. I can also see how often any given step or activity is occurring. So I can sort this high to low based on my occurrences and start to understand which events are occurring more frequently than others. Now you'll see as we go, I've got some iconography that I've assigned to a few of these steps to really visually represent what each step denotes, and you'll see as we go where that makes sense and where that will allow certain stages to stand out. But realistically, what you've done here is upload some icons, assign coloring, and it makes it more visually apparent to the end user. But from a configuration standpoint, the cost and the iconography is really all that I've done. Everything else here has been done automatically for me. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is our high-level representation of the business process using the Schema module. The Schema module gives us the ability to take a look at the dominant or most common way that our invoice process is executed. So you can build models here with varying levels of complexity. In this case, we're starting to understand exactly what our process looks like from a high-level perspective. Now, this is a dynamic model. It may look like a Visio diagram, but it's more analytical than that. You can see here the thickness of the lines in between any two stages. In this case, represents volume, where more invoices have gone one path versus another. So we can understand where volume occurs as a part of the model. We can change the metric and not focus on volume, but rather where time is spent. I changed to time length of transition, and now we see what's the average duration that it takes for us to go from one stage to the next. We can even get a look at throughput as a part of this model visualized. So when I turn on this animation, each circle represents an invoice or a group of invoices. You actually visualize the progression through the workflow, where things speed up and slow down. As you see things bunching up and backing up, that's a visual bottleneck. It's obviously going to negatively affect your throughput. Changing of colors represents aging. These are invoices that have been in the process for a longer period of time. So not only are we picking out exactly what our process looks like in this case, but we're starting to identify key areas that we may want to drill in on further analytically using some of these more deeply rooted tools here on the right. Okay. Now, Schema is a nice starting point. The one thing that this really does not introduce is the level of variation and repeatability of the process. If you have a really well-run, well-organized process that maybe only goes one of a handful of different ways, this can work to show you a good perspective on that. Now, when you start to get into a little bit more real-world, ad hoc, messy type of processes, case management, if you will, this really will fall apart. Because as soon as you start to build in all that variability, all the different possible variations, this becomes a spider web of lines, a plate of spaghetti, and really no human's going to be able to digest that or make sense of that analytically. So for those type of more messy real-world processes that we come across, we developed a number of different analysis tools to allow you to drill a bit further in on that type of data, starting with path analysis. Path breaks out every single execution pattern for how the process was followed in a frequency breakdown. Okay, so what you've got here is the most commonly executed sequence of steps showing here to the left, how often it's occurred. Count of timelines is the number of invoices that have gone one way versus another, and you can see it descending here. So you can clearly pick out in this case where things skip steps, go backwards to complete steps, maybe jump back and forth and iteratively do certain stages. And as I scroll to the right, you see more and more interesting and kind of obscure pathways for how this process is executed. So not only can we understand, how often any given set of behaviors is occurring, but we can relate this to risk. Are we skipping steps? Are we going backwards? Are we doing things out of order? Right? We can compare these execution patterns by duration. How long does it take us to process an invoice when we do one series of steps versus another? Obviously, we're going to focus on those that are taking us longer relatively than we expect. You can also visualize this a bit differently. This is a nice linear perspective. We've got the schema representation as well. If you like that schema model, now we can see things like branching and rework as you scroll across. See some interesting schemas. You've also got the ability to compare these different patterns or behaviors based on cost. So what is the bottom line cost to me as a processor when we run an invoice through one set of steps versus another? And if you see anything stand out here, whether it's based on risk, time, cost, you want to focus in on it, we've got something that's relatively high cost here, $19, and pretty high variant. We can select one or more of these pathways, apply a filter, And now everything that I do going forward is going to be scoped around these 1006 high cost invoices. All the metrics, now that I've set this filter, are going to flex to show me data relative to this 15%. And now I want to drill in and ask a few more specific questions about these cases specifically. I'll show you one last perspective we have on the process. So you've seen the high level schema, you've seen path with all the variations and repeatability. We have timelines, which is really our base level for the analysis. Each and every case has its own unique timeline broken out here, with the icons that I mentioned earlier representing the steps that have occurred along the way. So each line represents a single invoice, and if I select on any one of these, I get a detailed representation of what occurred with invoice number X. I've got the events in order, how they occurred. I've got time gaps in between them. I've got that attribute related data that we loaded, who was the vendor, the clerk for processing, the location, etc. I got the costs in any given stage. So this is a very granular, detailed view as to the end-to-end life cycle of any given invoice, and this is all available to you in the timelines view. So the most detailed, in-depth representation if you have a need to go down to this level, and having this level of depth is what allows us to zoom out and give you that schema and that path perspective on this process. Alright, so each and every invoice mapped out here. In this case, I've got my 1006 high cost invoices. What I might want to know now is, what are the trends or patterns in the data that point me in the direction of how I can go fix this issue? Right? I want to go now remediate this, because just knowing I have high cost behaviors occurring isn't really actionable. I need to know now where I can focus my efforts to fix the problem. So I can go to my breakdown view. What this allows us to do is use those attributes that we loaded to understand patterns or trends in the data around who, where, what, when, and so on. So we've got it right now broken down by department, and what looks to be a pretty even distribution here by department. Nothing really stands out from the pack, so nothing to report here necessarily. Maybe I now want to look at it by vendor. Are there any patterns? Well, it's kind of interesting in this case, right? Because I've got a single vendor responsible for a large percentage of my high cost invoices. So conceptually, you get the idea. In this case, we're looking for these outliers. Now, if I'm going to have a conversation, or if I'm going to drill a bit further in on any vendor's invoices, I know who it's going to be. I know who I'm starting with. It's Thrift Bank, and we're going to start to understand more about the quality of documents they're sending us, what kind of a procedure are we going through specifically with these, and then I'll work my way down the list. So this is how we can very quickly get to root cause correlation and focus our efforts towards fixing the underlying issue. Okay, one more module we'll touch on here in the discovery phase is going to be our bottleneck analysis. Now, what this is really useful for is understanding time at a more detailed level than just this overall duration. This duration metric is nice, but it's kind of high level. It's full end-to-end processing time. In most cases, you might want to know where time is spent at a more granular depth. So, specifically at the task or activity level, where are we spending the majority of our time? Here in Bottleneck, we can understand that. We have a couple of different ways to calculate time. We can calculate it based on the time from one event directly to the next following event. Or on the flip side, we can look at the amount of time that it took to go from the previous upstream event to that event. We can also have the system pair together events for us. So I like demonstrating it from this perspective because we've got event to event groupings or transitions here on the left. And it's showing us how often and how long it took to complete any one of these different tasks or transitions. So our top one right now is going from field extraction to field validation. We can see exactly how many times that's occurred, what's the average amount of time in hours it takes us to complete that, how does that roll up to the total amount of hours spent at this stage, and then as a percentage of all time spent processing these invoices, how much of it was spent at any given part of the process. And I like to sort this, and this is automatically generated, keep in mind. I'll sort this high to low based on this total time percentage metric, and what you start to understand is here's a stack ranking of our most costly process stages from a time perspective. And if we're focusing on automation, or just overall cycle time improvement, this is going to give you a very clear and concise list as to where you're spending the most amount of time, where you stand to gain the most amount of time back by making an improvement or focusing some kind of technology or re-engineering efforts on that stage of the process. And let's say, in this case, we have one that stands out from the rest, something going from AP received to level 1 approval. It's taking us 18 hours. Maybe we can focus on something like that. It's a very human task. Maybe we say we aim to drop this by, on average, 5 hours. So we won't go from 18 down to 13 hours. I can put that here in this new time field, hit enter, and actually then start to see in real time, if we make that level of improvement to this part of the process, here's the amount of hours I stand to gain back to the business by doing that type of work. Okay, so we can justify the work and do a bit of what if analysis around if we make these changes. We can do this not only with time, but also with driving cost out of the process. So we can start to understand where cost is being incurred, and then put in our new costs and understand how many dollars we stand to save. In essence, starting to do an ROI calculation on any type of process improvement. All right, we'll head back to the timelines view. Let's jump into the side-by-side analysis module. What this allows us to do is a set of comparisons or benchmarking for any one subset of our overall data against another. Now in this scenario, the concept that we're going to use is that of pre and post implementation. And implementation can mean a number of different things. We can talk about automation of certain tasks in the process. We can talk about injecting other workflow, OCR types of technology into the process. The point being, as you make changes, be they technological, be they human type of changes in your process, you want to track those changes over time to ensure that you're getting the value and the results out of that effort that you're going to put in to make the changes to begin with, right? We're going to want to justify and quantify the work that we've done. So what we've got is a pre-implementation set of data prior to going into production with technology X or changes in our process. What were our baselines? And you can see that here in the current set, which represents our pre-implementation. This would be the set of data where we did our initial process discovery, we analyzed, we found some inefficiencies, and we want to go off and cure those, right? What were our baselines at that point in time? And then since we've gone into production with those changes, how have we trended? Have the durations gone down? Has the cost gone down? Has our effort gone down? Right? We want to make sure we're actually clearly representing that. We don't just want to make these changes and then walk away and hope that they work, right? So over time, we'll track these, and we can say prior to implementation, 3 days. Since implementation, we cut a day on average off of our cycle time. Event count has gone down on aggregate. Average cost way down. So there you've got your ROI built in. The idea here, if you've actually improved the process and you're seeing results like these, so positive, phenomenal. You'd want to know that. Let's take this to the rest of the organization. Let's make more changes like this. It's been phenomenally successful. On the flip side, you'd want to know just as badly if you haven't had those types of results, right? If these numbers haven't changed or have even gone up per se, you're going to want to know so that you don't waste any further time on this project, or you say, hey, it's back to the drawing board. What we did here, maybe we moved the bottleneck down a couple of systems. We need to go back and reanalyze. Either way, having this level of visibility is increasingly valuable to those that are aiming to make real changes to their business processes. And this is something that you can take to management, and that is very, very clear exactly what's going on. All right, so that's our set-by-set comparison. Now, this doesn't need to be pre and post implementation. This could in theory be person against person, invoice type against type, location against location. Any kind of filtering set you can think of putting on your overall population, you can use for benchmarking and comparison here. Now, from side-by-side analysis, I want to jump into our query editor. What this allows us to do is ask specific type of pattern-related questions about our process flow. In this case, we've got a query already built out for us. What this query is asking is, how often do we have invoices that are rerouted not only once but 2 or more times. So we've already rerouted something twice. We then go on, and you would expect to have some level of approval on an invoice, but in this case we're saying we have not had any one level of approval being met. Level 1, level 2, level 3 have not happened. Yet somehow we've got an instance where this invoice has been paid in our ERP without having been approved. Obviously that would be a non-compliant flow, a very risky flow, something we would expect should never happen. Now this query editor is unique. It allows us to build in sequence, as you can see, things happening or not happening in context to other stages, repetitions of steps. We can look at time in between stages, whether more than or less than a certain amount of time has elapsed in between any stages. And we can even include these attribute values. So if we want to look at specific vendors or clerks or locations, etc., we can put those into this query. You can implement a lot of logic to make these queries very powerful and ask very specific questions in ways that I've yet to see be able to ask these questions in any other way. Okay, so you build it out graphically here, your business case, your question, and then you quite simply hit search, and it's going to give you a sub-second response time that tells you yes or no. In this case, yes. We've got these cases occurring in that type of behavior. Here are the 349 invoices that have exhibited that specific type of behavior. Now we're often figuring out where, when, who, how could this ever happen, etc. Okay, so that's our pattern search. Think of a business condition, a temporal sequence of events, and go and build it graphically within that query editor. Now, hand in hand with that query would be our protocols, and they're very similar but the inverse from a logic perspective. What a protocol allows you to do is not build in a search mechanism. This allows you to build in your expectations, your best practices, your SLAs, for example, things that when they occur should always happen in a certain order within a given time frame. Every process has certain set of rules where things can happen in variable ways, but when we hit a certain stage, we must execute this sequence of steps in order on time. All right, and so you can build in libraries of these different protocols around certain scenarios in the process. In this case, we've got a payment protocol that's been created. What this is saying is as soon as AP receives an invoice, we must go through level 1, coding, and paid in ERP, and within level 1 approval and payment, we want to make sure that's cut down to under 1 day. So this is a rule that we expect should always be followed. Now if you think about that query mechanism, that was a search tool. It showed me all the cases that matched the condition that I set forth. In this case, we don't really care those things that match, those things that follow our protocols. That's what we expect. What we'd be interested in are those that violate, those that breach, those that don't match. So we're looking at the invoice of a query. It's going to show us our violators. I click Show Violations here. I get a list of all the different possible ways that this protocol was violated. In this case, we've just got 2, a couple of steps missing. Things happening out of time violation. Things could happen out of order. They could happen the wrong amount of time. There are a number of different types of violations that could occur here. And if I want to drill in on any one of these protocol violations, I can apply this as a filter and get down to just the 965 invoices, for example, that were missing the coding step. Okay, so I can get down to that very quickly. Now this is a retroactive perspective on that process analysis. I come in here once my data has been loaded and I see how my protocol was violated. If you want to take a more proactive approach, both these queries and these protocols are set up to drive our alerting mechanism. So we have an operational monitoring and alerting tool here as well that allows us to build in these rules into graphic alerts and notify people prior to you breaching SLA, prior to you paying non-approved invoices, so that you can step in real time and make a change prior to some negative end result occurring. So all you do is simply define your query, define your protocol, maybe you use a deadline, define it here, right? And then say, how do we want it to be received? Via text message to these recipients, via email to these recipients, so we can notify humans so that they can step in and make changes or push things along, or we can send web service calls, which can be used to interface directly with third-party applications like an RPA tool, like a workflow tool, and automatically spawn downstream automated workflows or robotic processes aimed at remediating the issue that we've uncovered. So we can use TimelinePI to identify the issues in real time as data is being streamed into TimelinePI. We're checking against these alerts and rules, and then kicking off downstream workflows via these web service calls aimed at remediating the issue without involving a person, getting as close to closed loop remediation as is possible. Okay, so that's our alerting mechanism. What I'm going to leave you with is a bit of a different type of visualization, which are our dashboards. Here in the dashboards area, we've got something that's defined a little bit more for your business type of user. Everything we've gone through thus far has been really aimed at analyzing the business process, process improvement, compliance, and so on. If you have a process owner or a business user who's not going to be doing that deep analysis, we've got a dashboarding area for them where they can come in here, start to visualize some of their key metrics in a more familiar type of a visual, right? And these are all built very in drag and drop methodology, so you can build out varying different dashboards here scoped directly for that business user's role or that person specifically. All right, so you've gotten a look at a couple of the more popular analysis tools here directly within TimelinePI. We've gone through some process discovery, some deep analysis, some automated insights, as well as the alerting and monitoring mechanism. And with that, if you have more interest in getting a bit deeper into this, I would say request the training tools, and we get into more depth with each and every single one of these different tools.